A viewer recommended that I do an episode on the Beastie Boys, and it was an interesting idea. In the podcast that I do with my wife, which is also called Sound of History, look it up if you want more of this, we're talking about the birth of hip-hop right now and kind of like the late 70s to late 80s era of hip-hop. Plus, this is just an interesting band that I don't know a lot about, so I'm interested to kind of dig deeper into their story. So this is the story of the Beastie Boys. I'm sorry if my voice kind of gives out during this video. I've been sick for the past few days, but I got my tea right here, so hopefully it'll be all right. If you like these stories from music history, consider subscribing. I put out a few videos a month along with a lot of shorts and stuff, and I think something like 95% of people who watch my content aren't subscribed, so it's free and it's super easy to unsubscribe if you end up not enjoying it. And if you end up really enjoying this video, give it a like. If you didn't enjoy it, leave a comment below and let me know what I did wrong. And please keep leaving suggestions of bands that you want me to cover in the comments below. I always love looking at those. The Beastie Boys started in a transitional period in the underground music scene, especially in New York City. It was the Ramones and Patti Smith and Talking Heads and just that kind of CBGB scene. But in the 1980s, the outer boroughs started to have their say. Hip-hop, which started in Harlem and Queens, started to spread all over the city and all over the country. The Beastie Boys are actually one of the prime bands that showcase that transition because they started out as a punk band before they fell in love with hip-hop. Michael Diamond was born in Manhattan in 1965. His father was an art dealer and his mother was an interior designer, so he grew up surrounded by art all the time. His house was full of high-priced art because his mother loved collecting it, and he went to a kind of art-focused high school. It was almost like he was destined to be in the New York art scene. He talked about how growing up in New York at that time was still kind of dangerous, even for someone like him who grew up on the wealthier Upper West Side. He said there was really no point in even having a car radio because you knew it would just get stolen, and him and his friends would just adventure around the city and see what trouble they could get into. This was before cell phones, so they weren't connected to any help if anything bad happened. He said, quote, "Riding the subway could be nerve-wracking on a number of levels. The city felt so much more lawless, and yet the families that did stay here instead of move to the suburbs had a commitment to being here and letting their kids explore. As an individual and a band, we couldn't have become who we became without that freedom and that exposure." He grew up listening to legendary hardcore punk bands like Bad Brains and Black Flag. He became a part of a couple different bands like the Walden Jazz Band, but none of them really captured that raw, aggressive energy that he was looking for. So he decided that he wanted to get his own thing going. Jeremy Shayton, one of his friends from high school, brought him to see a punk show. Jeremy also brought his other friend, John Barry. As soon as the band started, John Barry got up and started pogoing and dancing like crazy, which made Michael think that John was out of his mind and there was something really messed up with him, which seems ridiculous. I mean, he's dancing at a rock show. It's what you're supposed to do. But Michael and John Barry discovered that they had a lot of the same interests and liked a lot of the same music, so they became pretty good friends. And they formed a band together with Mike on drums and John on the guitar. Soon enough, they brought in Jeremy to play bass, and they called themselves the Young Aborigines. John said, quote, "It was a terrible, terrible combination because none of us knew how to play, but we had a ton of enthusiasm," end quote. In July of 1981, Jeremy had to leave the city. I'm not sure what he was doing. I couldn't find that out. So they asked another guy that they knew named Adam Yauch to step in and play bass. Adam Yauch was another guy who was from New York. He was born in Brooklyn. His father was a Catholic architect, and his mother was Jewish and a school administrator and social worker, but he grew up unreligious. Adam also loved music, and he taught himself to play the bass, and after seeing the legendary punk band Black Flag perform, which is a band that I will probably definitely have to do an episode on, he decided that punk music was what he wanted to do. Also in 1981, they started to do some recording and brought in Kate Schellenbach to play drums. While the Young Aborigines were getting started, another punk band called The Young and the Useless was starting up, led by a young guy by the name of Adam Horovitz. Adam's father was a Jewish playwright who ended up leaving the family when Adam was around 3 years old. That kind of left Adam searching for a tribe to belong to. So he got a couple friends together and created a band called The Young and the Useless, which personally I think is a great name for a punk band. The Young and Useless were very young, even for a punk band at that time. When they started, their drummer was 13. and he said that they only invited him in because they didn't know anyone else who had a drum set. He also mentioned that they almost never rehearsed, which is super typical for punk bands at that time. Because the underground punk scene in New York, especially the more hardcore variety, wasn't all that large at that time, the Young Aborigines and the Young and the Useless started to play together at a few different clubs. Mostly at a club called A7, which was a haven for the kids who liked a more hardcore sound. John Barry described it as, quote, like playing in your living room with a bunch of drunken, scary children, end quote. There was also a local record store where a lot of the punk kids would hang out. It would be open all hours of the night, and the owner of that store wanted to start a little label, so he asked the Young Aborigines if he could record them, and they were more than happy to do that. That's how they recorded and released their debut EP called Pollywog Stew. At some point along the way, John Barry suggested they change their name to the Beastie Boys. Later on, they would claim it was always an acronym for Boys Entering Anarchistic States Towards Inner Excellence, but that acronym came much later. In 1982, the newly christened Beastie Boys and the Young and the Useless played together at Philip Poosey's party. Could be Poochie, I don't know. I'm bad at pronunciation, as you know if you've watched any of my other videos. But Philip, Poochie, I don't know, he wanted to make a short film. So what he did is he handed a couple different cameras out to people going to his party, and he asked them to film the Beastie Boys set, so you could kind of get this crowd perspective of the show. It's like the original POV trend from TikTok. POV, you're at a Beastie Boys show. But that film that he released under the name Beastie was the first appearance of the Beastie Boys on film. Around this time, John Barry started to become a little bit too unreliable. He got really into drinking and experimenting, as he called it. He would miss shows and he would miss rehearsals, so he was kicked out of the group and replaced with Adam Horowitz, who over the past few years had become really close with the other members of the Beastie Boys. John would go on to form a couple of other punk bands who were fun in their own right, but never really found the success that the Beastie Boys did. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 52 due to complications from dementia. By 1983, more and more of the emerging hip-hop sound was starting to find its way into the punk scene and into the Beastie Boys music. They released a song called Cookie Puss, which was based on a prank call that they made to a local ice cream shop, and that song was the first instance of the Beastie Boys rapping. It was also the first recording with Adam Horowitz, who is better known as Ad Rock, and the first use of sampling that they ever did. Even though it's not a great song, it became pretty popular in the underground dance clubs, like a club called Danceteria, which the boys would frequent quite a lot. So that probably inspired them to keep trying this whole hip-hop thing and see what they could do with it. They started to incorporate a DJ into their set, who was known as DJ Double R, or Rick Rubin. At that time, Rick was just a student at NYU. He's a very ambitious student, but he was just a student. Rick said, quote, "Through spending time with the Beasties, I grew to see that they had this great sense of humor. It wasn't that they were jerks, and even if it was, they were funny with it," end quote. That connection with Rick Rubin proved to be one of the most important that they ever made. Because later that year, Rick would form a record label in his dorm room with Russell Simmons called Def Jam Records. And Rick immediately asked the Beastie Boys if he could produce them for his new label. But before they made that full transition into hip-hop, they parted ways with their drummer, Kate Schellenbach. Michael Diamond, said later that they didn't think she fit the tough boy image that they needed for a hip-hop career, and he said that he regretted that decision ever since. For a few years after signing with Def Jam, they tried to find their audience. They toured with Public Image Limited, which was Johnny Rotten's post-Sex Pistols project, and then they toured with Madonna, which did not go well. Apparently, Madonna's manager called Russell Simmons and asked if the Fat Boys, which was a different group that Russell was not affiliated with, were available. And Russell lied and said the Fat Boys were busy, so he pitched them Run DMC, who was a Def Jam artist. Run DMC were too expensive for the Madonna tour, so he was like, how about the Beastie Boys? And that's how they ended up on this tour. Ad Rock later said about that tour, quote, "It's not like any of us knew Madonna that much, but we all used to hang out at Danceteria, so we knew about each other. I don't know why she thought it would be a good idea, though. It was a terrible idea, but it was great for her in a way because we were so awful that by the time she came on stage, the audience had to be happy." It was a really weird mix-up of what the Beastie Boys were trying to do and what the audience actually was. A lot of Madonna's fans at that time were younger, were teenage, preteen girls, and the Beastie Boys stage show was essentially a college rager with alcohol and strippers and just craziness. So it was just kind of like a weird mashup there that wasn't great. But they started to find their zone in 1986 when they released their debut album through Def Jam called License to Ill. I listened to that album again earlier today. It's great in its way. It became the best-selling rap album of the 80s and the first hip-hop album to hit number 1 in the charts. Their tour for that album was pretty notoriously wild, and it culminated in Liverpool when their set ended up in a riot and Ad Rock got arrested for assault. But all of that probably just helped their image. They weren't really that well received in the UK. They were kind of too rowdy for the British press. And one reporter even said, the Beastie Boys are a band of few words, most of them unprintable. After the success of License to Ill, they started to butt heads with Rick Rubin. The issues actually started on that tour with Madonna, where Rick Rubin was their first DJ, but he had to drop out after a couple of shows because he had an ear infection. And he was told by his doctors that he shouldn't fly and he should drop out of the tour or else he might lose his hearing. Much later, Mike D and Ad Rock said that they never really believed that Rick actually had an ear infection, and they thought he just wanted to drop out of the tour. They asked him about it on an interview a few years ago, and Rick told them that no, he really did have an ear infection. Rick always assumed that when they were done with that tour and got back to Manhattan, he would pick up with them again and be their DJ, but that never happened. They just kind of said, all right, well, this guy's our DJ now. And that allowed Rick to focus more on production, which ended up really well for him. He said, quote, that led to me focusing all my attention into production instead of being in a band, which could have happened. It just worked out, maybe the way it was supposed to. While they were out on tour with Run DMC, Rick finished production on License to Ill, which the trio saw as a bit of an overstep. Mike D said, quote, when we got back home from a Run DMC tour, we found Rick had gone and finished and mixed our whole record. It was weird that he just went and did it without us knowing, end quote. He also pointed out that this really bugged Adam Yauch, who's better known as MCA, because Adam really loved the behind-the-scenes production side of things. So the fact that he didn't get to be a part of that on their debut LP was a massive bummer for him. But Rick remembers it differently. Rick remembers Mike D calling him up while they were on tour and demanding to know why the album wasn't finished yet. And then, as there always is, there was disputes about money, both for unpaid royalties for the License to Ill album and also not being paid for shows that the Beastie Boys did. The nail in the coffin came when they were discussing the royalty split for a film involving the Beastie Boys. Ad Rock said, quote, we were talking about the movie, and Rick made a quick comment about splits. He was saying that Beastie Boys would get 10%, and him and Russell would get 90%. End quote. Rick responded to that by saying, quote, I don't remember a time when I talked about business, so it's odd, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I would say it sounds out of character, but I can't imagine Adam just making that up. End quote. So for their second album, they left Def Jam and signed with Capitol Records. License to Ill, even though it was commercially massive, was never taken seriously by the hip-hop heads. It was always considered pretty juvenile and childish. So for their second album, they wanted to prove that they were artists. They wanted to make a project with a lot more creative depth, even though that necessarily means that it was not nearly as commercial. Released in 1989, Paul's Boutique only hit number 14 in the charts. Part of that was probably because it was really underpromoted by Capitol, but it's since become seen as one of the Beastie Boys' better albums. The album was mostly recorded in Los Angeles. It was originally started in a friend's apartment in Manhattan, but when Capitol Records got wind of that, they weren't that happy and forced the band to finish it up at the record plant. Mike D wasn't all that happy with moving across the country. He said, quote, it was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars fronted us by Capitol, which would come out of our royalties. It was even more of a waste because we still liked many of the instrumental tracks from Matt's Apartment best anyway. End quote. For their next album, Check Your Head in 1992, they decided to release it on their own label, distributed by Capitol, but still more creative control for them. They created Grand Royal Records to release the album, and for this, they went back to their punk roots and played all of the instruments on it themselves. The album peaked at number 10 and went double platinum. People say that Grand Royal Records is more of a vanity label, but I think that's underselling it. They signed a lot of eclectic artists to this label and were able to experiment with a lot of cool different sounds and styles that they wouldn't get to do as just the Beastie Boys. So I think for that alone, it was probably worth what they did, and it was more than just a vanity label. Their next album, Ill Communication, in 1994, was another massive success, largely based on the single Sabotage being in near constant rotation on MTV. That album debuted at number 1. So by 1995, they were on top of the world. They had their own label, which allowed them more creative freedom and allowed them to experiment with different artists. They had a #1 album. They had announced an arena tour where a few of the dates sold out in 30 minutes. They went on a tour of South America and Southeast Asia for the first time. And they went back to the studio to record an album that would become Hello Nasty, which was released in 1998 and also debuted at #1. But through the mid to late 90s, these party boys were kind of settling down a bit. Ad Rock was finalizing a divorce from actress Ione Sky. I'm sorry, again, pronunciation, not my strong suit. And Ad Rock started dating legendary Riot Girl Kathleen Hanna, who he would end up marrying. MCA had converted to Buddhism by this point, and he met his wife, who was a Tibetan American named, Dechen Wangdu. I'm really sorry. I'm doing my best. That's a hard one for me, and I don't mean to be disrespectful towards that name or Tibetans. But MCA met her at a Harvard speech in 1995. And Mike D had been married to music video director Tamra Davis since 1993. Also in this 90s era, they did a lot to influence other aspects of culture outside of just music. They became associated with a clothing brand called X Large, which was one of the biggest streetwear brands. Their music was incorporating so many elements of rock and punk and hard rock and heavy metal into hip-hop, which was essentially creating a whole new genre. They kept reinventing themselves and reinventing their audience along the way, scoring hit after hit after hit. Through the rest of the 90s and the early 2000s, they continued to release albums that were genre-defining and commercially successful. They were building on that foundation that they had laid through the first part of their career. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2011, but MCA wasn't able to attend because he had just been admitted into the hospital. A couple years earlier, he had been diagnosed with kind of a rare form of gland cancer, and he originally assured his fans that it was very treatable and that they had caught it early. But on May 4th, 2012, MCA passed away from cancer at the age of 47. After his death, Mike D confirmed that him and Ad Rock would not make more music under the Beastie Boys name. I saw an interview they did with LL Cool J, and LL Cool J asked them, would MCA want them to keep making music? And Ad Rock said, yes, I think he would, but the Beastie Boys was them three, and there was no band without MCA. So I think where they landed was they would keep working together, they would keep making music, but without MCA, it isn't the Beastie Boys. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of a really respectful way to put it. Beastie Boys being respectful. Who would have thought that? Since then, Mike D and Ad Rock have released a book about their time as Beastie Boys that I think was made into a movie. Mike D has worked as a producer for rock bands like Portugal the Man and Soft Play. He also hosts a Apple Music podcast called The Echo Chamber. Ad Rock has played bass in a band called The Tender Moments, which is the backing band of a cabaret singer, and he acted in a few different movies. The Beastie Boys were seriously pioneers in the music industry. They defined and created so many different genres. They continually reinvented themselves and found success in everything they tried to do. And what really struck me while I was researching this was watching the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. Since MCA wasn't able to be there, the guys didn't perform, and instead a couple different artists covered Beastie Boys songs in like a medley, like Kid Rock and Travie McCoy, and I forgot the other one. But it really struck me how they were doing the same songs. They were sounding good, but it just wasn't the same. It was kind of weird. And I think that really drove home to me that the Beastie Boys were so good because of who they were. It wasn't necessarily the songs, even though a lot of them were great. It wasn't the production, even though a lot of that was great too. It was just their energy and their aura. And I think that's something that can't be replicated. It can't easily be duplicated. And it really makes them one of a kind. And that's the story of the Beastie Boys. If you liked it, let me know. Drop a like, leave a comment, share it with a friend. If you didn't, please drop a comment. Tell me what I did wrong. Let me know of anything that I overlooked. I'm sure there's a ton of stuff I could have covered that I didn't have time to. So please share your stories in the comments about the Beastie Boys, your love for them, what you think is the most important thing about them. One of my favorite things about doing these videos is reading the comments about people's experiences going to shows or seeing this band or meeting this person. It's just always really cool to kind of like have those personal perspectives on these bands I cover and spend hours researching. So please keep doing that in the comments below. I'd love to see them.